Did Jesus' earliest followers consider him to be God?
Well, what I argue in the book is that during his lifetime, Jesus himself didn't call himself God and didn't consider himself God, and that none of his disciples had any inkling at all that he was God. The way it works is that you do find Jesus calling himself God in the Gospel of John, our last Gospel. Jesus says things like, before Abraham was, I am, and I and the Father are one, and if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. These are all statements that you find only in the Gospel of John. And that's striking because we have earlier Gospels and we have the writings of Paul, and in none of them is there any indication that Jesus said such things about him. I think it's completely implausible that Matthew, Mark, and Luke would not mention that Jesus called himself God if that's what he was declaring about himself. That would be a rather important point to make. So this is not an unusual view among scholars. It's simply the view that the Gospel of John is providing a theological understanding of Jesus that is not what was historically accurate.
So Jesus saw himself as the Messiah. What else did that mean in its time?
Well, a lot of Christians today have a wrong idea about what the Messiah was supposed to be. The word Messiah is a Hebrew word that literally means the anointed one. This was used in reference to the kings of Israel. The ancient kings of Israel, when they became king during the coronation ceremony, would have oil poured on their head as a sign of divine favor. And so the king of Israel was called God's anointed one, the Messiah. There came a point at which there was no longer a king ruling Israel, and some Jewish thinkers began to maintain that there would be a future king of Israel, a future anointed one, and they called that one the Messiah. And so the Messiah for most Jews simply referred to the future king of Israel. And so when Jesus told his disciples that he himself was the Messiah, he was saying that in the future, when God establishes the kingdom once more, I myself will be the king of that kingdom. And so it's not that the Messiah was supposed to be God. The Messiah was not supposed to be God. The Messiah was a human being who would be the future king. And that's probably what Jesus taught his disciples that he was.
When you're asking the question of, did Jesus really rise from the dead? Was there really an empty tomb, a tomb that he had been buried in? As a scholar of the historical Jesus, where'd he go to try to answer those questions?
Well, there are some questions that history can answer and other things that history cannot answer. What I try to teach my students is that history is not the past. Now, that seems a little strange to my students, but I explain there are a lot of things in the past that we cannot show historically. For example, you can't show, even if you want to, you simply can't show what my grandfather ate on March 23rd, 1956. I mean, he ate something for lunch that day, I'm sure, but there's no way we have access to it. So it's in the past, but it's not part of history. History is what we can show to have happened in the past. One of the things that historians cannot show as having happened in the past is anything that's miraculous. Because to believe that a miracle has happened, to believe that God has done something in our world, requires a person to believe in God. It requires a theological belief. But historians can't require theological beliefs to do their work. That's why historians, whether they're historians of World War II or of the Napoleonic age or of ancient Alexandria, Egypt, historians who deal with historical subjects don't invoke miracle because it's beyond what historians can prove. Miracles may have happened in the past, but they're not part of history. So that applies to the resurrection of Jesus. Historians acting as historians, whether they're believers or non-believers, as historians, they simply cannot say Jesus was probably raised by God from the dead. But historians can look at other aspects of the resurrection traditions and see whether they bear up historically. So, for example, the question, was there an empty tomb? Was Jesus put in a tomb and 3 days later that tomb was found empty? Well, that's a historical question. And to answer it, it doesn't require any set of religious beliefs. You can simply look at the sources and come and draw some historical conclusions.
Okay, so one of the things you look at is typically what happened to the bodies of men who were crucified. And when you try to answer that question, what answers do you come up with?
We never have any literary descriptions in any writing at all. There's no description of how exactly crucifixion was performed. But there are references in ancient Greek and Latin texts that refer to people who have been crucified. And what is striking is that in virtually every instance we're told that the person was left on the cross in order to rot away and to be eaten by scavengers. So that the punishment of crucifixion wasn't simply the torture involved, it also was the horrible effect of not being given a proper burial.
The desecration of the body after death.
Absolutely. The body was to be desecrated, and this was scandalous to ancient people, but the Romans did it this way as a disincentive for crime. So it's not just that you're going to go through a horrible death. Your body is going to rot on the cross, and scavengers are going to eat it. And this is the typical procedure for crucifixion in the ancient world. And so I ask in my book, is it likely that there was an exception in the case of Jesus? So in the Gospels, of course, Joseph of Arimathea asks for Jesus' body, and Pontius Pilate gives it to him, and then Joseph puts it in his tomb, and 3 days later that tomb is found empty. Well, I ask the question in my book, is Pilate, from what we know about him from other sources, likely to have made an exception with Jesus or with anyone else? I think it's highly unlikely for reasons that I lay out in the book, given what we know about Pilate from other sources. Pilate was not a nice fellow. He was not concerned about the people that he ruled. He was ruthless. He was hard-hearted. He was mean-spirited. And he simply did not care about the religious sensibilities of the Jews in Palestine, as we learned from several episodes in both Josephus and Philo. And so even if the Jewish authorities who had arranged for Jesus to be crucified with Pilate, even if they decided, well, let's give him a decent burial, there's nothing in the record to suggest that Pilate would ever do that. And we have no record of any governor of any province in the entire Roman Empire who would bow to the religious sensibilities of their people in order to give somebody a decent burial. And so it seems unlikely to me that the exception was made in the case of Jesus.
Say an exception was made. Do you have other questions about the entombment of Jesus before the resurrection?
Yeah, before I wrote this book and did the research on it, I was convinced, as many people are, that Jesus was given a decent burial, and on the third day the women went to the tomb, found it empty, and that started the belief in the resurrection. Apart from the fact that I don't think Jesus was given a decent burial, that he was probably thrown into a common grave of some kind, apart from that, I was struck in doing my research by the fact that the New Testament never indicates that people came to believe in the resurrection because of the empty tomb. And this was a striking find because it's just commonly said that that's what led to the resurrection belief. But if you think about it for a second, it makes sense that the empty tomb wouldn't make anybody believe. If you put somebody in a tomb and 3 days later you go back and the body's not in the tomb, your first thought is not, oh, he's been exalted to heaven and made the Son of God. Your first thought is, somebody stole the body, or somebody moved the body, or hey, I'm at the wrong tomb. You don't think he's been exalted to heaven. And in the New Testament, it's striking that in the Gospels, the empty tomb leads to confusion, but it doesn't lead to belief. What leads to belief is that some of the followers of Jesus have visions of him afterwards.
Okay, and then you question those visions. What are your questions about the visions?
We know a lot about visions from modern research. It turns out that about 1 out of 8 people among us has had some kind of visionary experience in which we've seen something that wasn't really there, and we're convinced that, in fact, it was there. That's a vision. Now, the way I write my book is that I leave open the question of what caused these visions of the disciples. People who are Christian will say the reason the disciples had visions of Jesus after his death is because he was raised from the dead and he appeared to them. And so they would call these visions appearances of Jesus. Non-Christians would look at the same information and say the disciples had hallucinations. And so I got interested in this question of hallucinations and started to look into it. And it turns out that hallucinations are very common among people still today. And 2 of the most common kinds of hallucinations are of deceased loved ones and of revered religious figures. So in terms of deceased loved ones, sometimes somebody will have a vision of his grandmother in his bedroom a couple weeks after his grandmother dies. That happens a lot. In terms of revered religious figures, we have all sorts of documented reports of the Blessed Virgin Mary appearing to hundreds of people at one time, thousands of people at one time. And so in my chapter, I deal with these incidents of visions that we know about from the modern period and from history, and then I point out that a historian, as a historian, can certainly say that some of Jesus' followers had visions of him, and that since they had visions of him, they thought that he was no longer dead. And since they were the kinds of Jews who thought that afterlife was lived in the body, that it wasn't that your spirit lived on after your body died, but that the afterlife was a bodily existence, if they thought Jesus was alive again, they necessarily thought that he was alive again in his body. And this is then what begins the belief in Jesus' bodily resurrection.
You write that the first 20 years after the death of Jesus is particularly significant in perceiving Christ as God. What happens during those first 20 years after his death?
Those 20 years are really both really important and really mysterious, because we don't have any Christian writings from the period. The earliest Christian author we have is the Apostle Paul, whose letters were written mainly in the 50s of the Common Era. So if Jesus died around the year 30, and Paul's first letter is around 50, and that's our earliest writing, that means that we have a 20-year gap where we have no writings at all by any Christian. And so it's a complicated period to study. What I argue in my book is that in the New Testament, including in the letters of Paul and in the book of Acts, for example, there are occasional passages that scholars have identified as what they call pre-literary traditions. What that means is that the authors are quoting materials that had been in circulation prior to the time of their writing, and so they're pre-literary in their traditions because they've been floating around for a while. What's interesting is when you isolate the pre-literary traditions in Paul, in the book of Acts, that refer to Jesus and his status as the Son of God, what these consistently point to is that Jesus became the Son of God when God raised him from the dead. That it was at the resurrection of Jesus that God made Jesus his Son. This is what I call an exaltation Christology. Christology simply means your view of Christ, and an exaltation Christology is one that says that Christ had been a human being and that God had exalted him to a position of divinity. The earliest Christians, during those first 20 years, the very earliest Christians appear to have thought that that's what happened.
So what were some of the beliefs in ancient times, in the times of Christ, about divine beings and earthly people, and whether they had any interaction at all, and whether there were divine beings on earth?
Many of us think of Jesus as the only miracle-working Son of God of the ancient world. As it turns out, he wasn't the only one. There were a lot of individuals in antiquity, in Greek, Roman, and Jewish circles, who were thought to be both human and divine. There were basically three ways that this could happen. Sometimes you have a human being who is a superior human being, either unbelievably powerful or beautiful or wise, and because of this person's superiority, a god or the gods or the God of Israel exalts the person to heaven and makes that person a divine being. So the person starts out as a human and becomes divine. That's one way that a human can be divine. A second way is that sometimes in legend and mythology, a divine being will have sex with a mortal, and the offspring will be a divine human. So that, for example, that's how Hercules is born. Hercules' mother is a mortal, but his father is Jupiter, the king of the gods. So that's a second way, someone born to the union of a divine being and a mortal being. The third way is that sometimes divine beings can take on human shape. And so when Jupiter comes down to get Hercules' mother pregnant, he comes down in the form of a human. And so gods can temporarily become human. Now, these ways of looking at it are found in Greek and Roman mythology, but they're also found in Jewish texts. The Christians took up all three ways and applied them to Jesus. The earliest Christians maintained that Jesus was a human being who was made God, a divine being. Later they ended up saying that Jesus was born to the union of God and a mortal because the Holy Spirit came upon Mary, and that's how she conceived Jesus. So Jesus literally had God as his father. And then later Christians started to say that in fact Jesus was a divine being who temporarily became a human being. So these three ways of understanding divine humans in the ancient world are picked up by Christians who develop their Christologies accordingly.